Australia is at a crossroads. With its thumping majority, the Labor government has an opportunity to deliver generational reform. At the Australia Institute, we'll keep fighting to make big gas pay, to build a fairer tax system, and to make the truth matter again. But we can't do it without your support. By making a tax-deductible donation today to our end of financial year appeal, you'll help fund research changing Australia for the better. You can give now by visiting our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or via the link in the show notes.
For more than 30 years, the Australia Institute has been producing research that matters. But how do you turn big, bold ideas into positive change? In this series, I'll be speaking to some of Australia's and the world's best thinkers about how we can make change for the better. I'm Paul Barclay, and you're listening to What's the Big Idea?, brought to you by the Australia Institute. Today I'm speaking to Christine Milne, AO, leader of the Australian Greens from 2012 to 2015, and before being elected to the Senate in 2002, she was elected to the Tasmanian Parliament in 1989. She went on to become the first female leader of a political party in that state. She's held the balance of power with the federal Gillard minority Labor government from 2010 to 2013 and with Tasmanian Labor and Liberal minority governments. She's a lifelong environmental, social justice and democracy advocate, has been arrested and imprisoned for her environmental advocacy, and is currently a Global Greens ambassador. Thanks for joining us, Christine.
Thanks, Paul.
Now, in your contribution to What's the Big Idea?, you argue for a change to how we elect our members of Parliament. The reform you want to see is proportional representation for all houses of Parliament, federal and state. But before we talk about why you're advocating this, can you just talk us through the various electoral and voting systems we currently have in our parliaments? I'm not sure everyone's intimately acquainted with this.
Well, Paul, that could take the whole podcast itself, and I'm not Anthony Green explaining the system, but I think it's enough to say that with proportional representation, you can expect the same percentage of seats as you get with the vote. So, for example, in the case of the Australian Greens, if they got 10% of the vote, then they would get 10% of the seats in the House of Representatives. Whereas currently that doesn't happen because of our voting system. So the main thing to remember with proportional representation is that you vote for the party or the person, and if they get the percentage, whatever the percentage of the vote declared to be electable, so some systems would say you have to get 4% of the vote and over that, etc. But you essentially get the number of seats. So that's proportional. And that's essentially what the Senate does. In the upper houses in Australia generally have a proportional representation system, and every system is slightly different. However, in the lower house, the House of Government, we have a preferential voting system in the House of Representatives. And so what that means is the whole country is divided into individual electorates for the lower house, and people at independents and parties stand in that, and you are required to number on your ballot paper your preference. So you might put a preference for a major party, you might put a preference for an independent, then number 2, the party you'd like to be in government, number 3, etc. And then that system, they go through several counts until somebody ends up with 50%. You have to get a majority share of the vote to be preferential. So preferential is more democratic than first past the post, but it's not as democratic as a proportional representation system, and that's why I argue we have to move to the next step.
So we have seen in recent times a big decline in the dominance of the two major parties, the Labor and Coalition. I think their collective vote now is less than 70%, somewhere around that. Close to a third of voters now vote for minority parties and independents. As a result, we're seeing more minority parties and independents in our parliament, including in our lower house, where, as you say, preferential voting makes it more difficult for those candidates to get in. But we are seeing, nonetheless, some Greens, some so-called Teals candidates making it into the lower house, the House of Government. Your point, though, is that the number of candidates being elected to Parliament, even now, that increased number, is not reflective of the proportion of the votes that they're receiving. And that's why you're advocating for proportional representation.
Yes, that's right. And then the second reason I'm advocating for it, and so as an example here, after the last election in 2022, I think there were 16 people who are on the crossbench. That would have been the largest crossbench, and that includes 4 Greens that we've ever had in Australia. But having said that, the problem is you have to decide who is going to go into government. So let's assume after an election, neither of Labor or the LNP gets more than 50% of the seats. The people on the crossbench have to decide which one they will allow to govern. And it is at that point that they have real influence, because it is that point they can say, okay, well, I'll only support you in government if you agree to a certain measure or series of things. Now, the Greens did that in 2010 in our agreement with the Gillard government. And one of those things was that we bring in a carbon price, that it be legislated by the 1st of July 2012, and then a multi-party committee would be established to work out the details. So that's when you have power, because both sides of politics are desperate to be government. And the same goes for, obviously, any independents elected the same. In that case, it was Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott. These days, there's a whole lot more. But the fact is that once the party has got the numbers to be government and sworn in as government, they then, in the case of Albanese in 2022, with 32% of the primary vote, they end up with 100% of the ministries, 100% essentially of control over the budget, over government appointments, over committees, over which legislation is brought forward, and so on and so forth. Unless you have a mechanism for actually sharing power, then after the government is sworn in, essentially they retain all the power. And even though you might have a crossbench which is seriously committed to climate action, because Liberal and Labor are so closely aligned in their support from the fossil fuel industry and for the fossil fuel industry, they vote with one another. So it doesn't matter how many on the crossbench oppose native forest logging, Liberal and Labor always vote together to support loggers. Same with new coal mines, same with Woodside, any gas operations, Beetaloo, and so on. So therein lies the problem. If you want to bring about change, and a lot of Australians do want to bring about change, you're not going to get significant change as long as the major parties actually have almost the same policies, just different by a matter of degree, and they will vote with one another to defeat the forces for change. That's why you need shared power.
So we've got a number of Teals in the Parliament at the moment, a number of Greens. I'm talking about the lower house. They're able to exert some influence, some pressure. Obviously, more pressure will be able to be exerted if they're in a minority government, a balance of power situation. A lot of people are very excited about these newer voices coming in, breaking the duopoly that the two parties have. They believe that the Teals, increased numbers of minority parties, will deliver better policy, more change. You're not quite as excited about that, about their ability to do so without more significant change to our electoral system. You think there'll be limits on what they're able to do, even with their increased numbers in the current arrangements?
Absolutely, Paul, and that's what we've seen for the last 3 years of the Albanese government from 22 to 25. So everyone was excited about the Climate 200 independents being elected. Now, they don't have balance of power in the lower house, But even so, people thought they would have significant influence on the Labor Party's agenda. Well, they haven't. That's the fact of the matter. Liberal and Labor will vote together. The Greens, however, and others in the Senate have had balance of power. But again, the problem has been that Labor and Liberal will vote together to defeat them having any serious influence on policy. And the example I'd give you is the safeguard mechanism. Labor wanted 100% offsets. No one in the environment movement thought that was a good policy. Everybody came out and said, no, that is terrible, but it didn't matter. Labor could rely on the coalition to support them. So the issue here is that we need two things. We obviously need a whole lot of new ideas about how you respond to biodiversity collapse, how you respond to increasing inequality, how you respond to, obviously, racism, to the immigration. There are a whole lot of really critical issues facing Australia. And people want change. They want new thinking. They want big picture vision. And that is one debate that the whole community can have, and we are having in various ways through think tanks, and the Australia Institute does a really good job at leading the debate in many of those areas. However, you might come up with what you need to happen, but making it happen requires on the political system being able to deliver it. And that is why people are so disenchanted at the moment, because they know what needs to happen. They know what they want to happen, but it isn't happening because the political process is not enabling it, because both of the major parties in Australia are essentially neoliberal parties to a greater or a lesser degree. So if the only opportunity to force them into something different is at the point when they form government, then that means that that crossbench of whoever they are going to have a united position on some of those policies, like climate, for example. But they don't. If you go around and talk to the community independents, they say, yes, we want stronger action on climate. And you say, well, what are you going to ask for? Specifically, what are you going to ask for? And they say, oh, we're not a party. We are our own community independent. We'll represent our communities, which is great. But you're not going to force a significant concession in a party wanting government unless you're united on a strong position. That is one of the problems with the, I think, inflated idea of what people who are elected in balance of power can do. And that's why essentially the Greens became a political party, so that we could have a united position, one strong position on a certain thing. That doesn't mean to say that the independents couldn't get together and do the same. They can. The question is, will they? Will they? The trouble is, once they're in government, that is where it's very hard to force change because, as I mentioned, the major parties vote together. So that's why if you have proportional representation and you end up with the proportion of seats according to the proportion of votes, that means you'd have the Labor Party with 32% of the seats, the coalition with whatever they get, Nationals and so on, although they're in the coalition, and the independents, whatever, across the board. And in my view, the more the merrier. A representative democracy needs to represent all points of view.
Yeah.
Once they're there and they've got that number of seats, then it is not up to the smaller groups to say we'll support one or other. It is negotiated amongst them all, and you'll get various combinations. And that's what happens in Europe all the time, where you see a centre-left party will combine with a more radical party, or in sometimes a more conservative party. And sometimes there are half a dozen parties, in fact, more often than not, that form those coalition governments. They share the ministries, and that means that the power of the corporates is severely reduced because it brings the power back to the parliament and to that negotiation. Whereas at the moment, when you have one or other of the majors in power, the corporates donate to those political parties. They in turn deliver the policies. And those deals are done in back rooms. They're not done on the floor of the parliament. And that is why it's really democratic to have a combined group of people sharing power and negotiating outcomes on behalf of the community, not on behalf of their corporate donors.
Yes, it might seem rather esoteric or arcane talking about electoral systems, but the point that you make is a very clear point, that proportional representation actually wrests power away, for the reasons that you've just argued, from corporate-owned and controlled two-party system, and we've seen a range of policy outcomes that have been the result of that. You also have mentioned there that you get greater deliberation with more parties, more independents across the spectrum. Obviously, a more broadly representative parliament, because those individuals and parties that are getting 10, 15, 20% of the vote, now it's very hard for them to find a seat in the lower house. So all of a sudden, Parliament starts to look quite different, doesn't it? And functioning of government would start to look quite different. Of course, the claim that you get from some, and it is a claim that we're already hearing, for example, from the Murdoch press about the upcoming election, which people are predicting may well result in a minority government, is that this just leads to chaos and instability. Your response to that?
That is exactly what you would expect from multinationals and from the Murdoch press. Of course, the decision in the courts in the UK have demonstrated what tactics the Murdoch press get up to in relation to illegal behaviours, etc. So overseeing criminal behaviour is not something that to be lauded, I wouldn't have thought. But anyway, what we've got is every single time it looks as if there might be a minority government in Australia, the multinationals run mad and put huge amounts of advertising into we have to have a majority. You can't have a minority. A majority gives you stable majority government, whereas minority is unstable, and all these ratbags have influence over the government of the day, etc., etc. What they actually mean is stable majority government means that they have the certainty that they can make a donation, negotiate an outcome, and know that it'll be delivered regardless of the arguments on the floor of the House, because the numbers are there to honour whatever the deal has been done in that back room. Whereas with minority government, they can't do that. That's why they absolutely hated the Gillard years with the clean energy package and all we succeeded in doing with the carbon price. And that's why they got so heavily behind Abbott to get rid of it, because they wanted the certainty that their fossil fuel donations kept buying an increase in fossil fuels. But it's the same with the gambling lobby. You see that all the time. And we've had several AstroTurf organisations appear out of nowhere. In the past in Tasmania, we had a group suddenly appear, Tasmanians for a Better Future. It so happened the government of the day was campaigning on a better Tasmania. Oh, just looked like that, just aligned slogans. They would never say who they were, never said where the money came for the extensive advertising, but it was the business lobby in Tasmania that essentially bought that election. We've had the gambling lobby buy an election down here in 2018, and the fossil fuel, property sector, gambling sectors. We know which sectors they are, and they can, once they've got a majority government in place, they determine what the agenda is by their donations, and no amount of donations reform is going to change that currently. And that's why shared power is a much better thing to aspire to. And as you said, much more democratic. It actually reflects what Australia looks like. It gives you the diversity of the characters, the opinions, and so on that you would see in the community. And for the first time, there will be people who feel like they are represented.
I'm Paul Barclay, and I'm talking to the former leader of the Australian Greens, Christine Milne, about how proportional representation can help restore democracy. Christine's written about this in the book, What's the Big Idea?, an anthology of big ideas put together by the Australia Institute, which you can buy now. It also features chapters by Yanis Varoufakis, Jennifer Robertson, Lucy Turnbull, Richard Dennis, and other leading thinkers, and they remind us the solutions to our big challenges are already there. They already exist. Australia just needs the courage to implement them. Just going back to something you said earlier, Christine, about your criticism of the two major parties being that they share a neoliberal consensus. They share a kind of overarching view of how the economy and society should be run. Do you think that the decline that we're seeing in the share of the vote that the two big parties currently have is a result of people actually rejecting that neoliberal consensus?
I do. I think people recognise that all that talk of small government, privatisation being, better than public ownership, private sector being so-called more efficient and so on, people have seen that fail. They've seen it fail from one end of the planet to the other. And you don't have to read many books to see that inequality is now one of the overwhelming issues for humankind. So we are seeing the hollowing out of public service. We now have a ministerial service, not a public service. So people expect public servants to be acting on their behalf. But in fact, because we have a senior executive service, they just operate for what the politicians want, who are operating for what the big business wants. So people see it has failed them. What they're seeing is that they have less quality of life. They seem to have to work harder for the same amount. Everything is costing them more, and they're seeing the environment deteriorate around them. So that inequality, environmental destruction, and fear about the future with extreme weather events, just have to look at people are panicking about insurance, whether their house will even have any value in the future because they might be in an area where they can't get insurance and so on. People are seeing that multinational business has ripped them off, is not paying the taxes it ought to pay. I mean, the Australia Institute has done a really good job on the issue of tax, especially in looking at the gas industry and how little, it pays, and how, in fact, you've got teachers and nurses paying more tax than some of the big multinationals, for example. People see that. They know it's not fair. And so, the whole Australian ethos really is about fairness and egalitarianism. People like to think that Australia is a country of the fair go. Well, increasingly people don't think that anymore. They feel like they're being ripped off, they're not being represented, that the big corporations are making profits on their backs, and they're not happy. So I think all that goes to say that the overwhelming majority feel like that, but because the majors are so reliant on donations from those very narrow range of industries and interests, they're both reflecting the neoliberal idea. And neoliberalism is over. Let's face it, it's over globally. But the problem is when there's a vacuum at the end of an era like neoliberalism, if you haven't got a strong framework to replace it, then there's a lot of messiness and a lot of failed experiments. We need to now look at it and go, yes, we've got the solutions. As you rightly say in the book, there are a number of solutions to many of the issues we've raised. But the question is, how do we deliver those solutions in a political system that is designed to protect the perpetrators of the problem?
There's growing support too for proportional representation around the world. The UK is a very good example. They have far fewer independents and minority parties in their parliament because they have a first-past-the-post system that makes it even harder for that to occur. Just a snapshot of what that means. At the last election, Labor got a vote share of about 34% of the vote. That translated for them to 63% of the seats in the Commons, about 410, 411 seats out of 650 seat parliament. So that in turn has led people to question, well, is that fair? But more to the point, there are countries right now that have a form of proportional representation in their government. Can you give us an idea of where that's happening and perhaps if it is leading to some of the improved outcomes that you've been talking about?
Well, first of all, just in relation to the UK, the Labor Party membership voted for a change to the electoral system in the United Kingdom and for the House of Commons to go to proportional representation. And the Labor Party membership strongly behind it. But the elected members, the current Prime Minister, has totally rejected what the membership wants. And I think that will only increase the level of disillusionment and anger about that. But proportional representation is fundamentally the European way. Virtually all European countries have some form of proportional representation. Sometimes it takes them months, which would send the Murdoch press into complete fit, months to negotiate a government. And frequently the governments change, ministers change and things in the course of it because one party or other comes out of the coalition or joins the coalition or has different priorities within the coalition. But what it means is that European governments do represent the broad perspectives in their own countries. And everybody feels like their vote at least someone can end up representing them. Whereas in our system, in the lower house, that doesn't happen.
Interestingly too, proportional representation for Australian parliaments is not actually a new idea. It's been advocated since at least the 19th century. Catherine Helen Spence was one of its big early proponents. Not a new idea, but it is a big reform, even if it doesn't, I should say, require a referendum. How would we go? You've done a good job of explaining it, explaining what you think it would deliver, how it would deal with the disproportionate amount of power that corporates influence on our politics. How would we go about achieving it? How do we even begin the process of informing Australians about the benefits of it? How do we move this forward?
Well, the first thing is it can't be seen to be a party political process. Otherwise, it'll be doomed before it even starts. And tragically, what we saw with The Voice was that by politicising the issue, it inevitably led to conflict, and the same with the addressing global warming in Australia, because the fossil fuel companies decided to make it a party political issue, and the coalition opted for climate denial. It became in Australia for so long a completely polarising issue. So donations reform and electoral reform need to be dealt with in a way that tries to take it out of the political process as much as possible. And that's why I would be calling for some sort of commission to be appointed, especially of academics and electoral experts and policy experts from across our universities and so on. Some appointed by all sides of politics, if you like, and then that commission would take evidence and hearings and so on and try to get some recommendations that are as depoliticised as you could possibly make it, notwithstanding its highly political issue. But we've seen what happens with donations reform every time it gets to a certain point in the parliament. The reason it never goes any further is because Labor and Liberal agree there is a bottom line by which they will not go, and that whatever happens, it must advantage them compared with the independents. So that inevitably would happen if you went to electoral reform, if it was determined by the parliament. People are not going to vote to put themselves out of business. So it has to be somehow taken out of that. But I'm just really motivated by the idea that so much emphasis is now going into what needs to be done. What are the solutions? What are the policy solutions? But not an equal amount of emphasis on, well, we've got those solutions. How do we actually get them implemented? Because it's no use we've had the solutions to global warming for years. We just haven't got the mechanism to implement them.
Yes, and I wonder whether or not the disillusionment that you sense in the community toward contemporary modern-day politics, I wonder whether that's actually an advantage for those arguing for proportional representation. And that disillusionment, it's on both sides. I speak to a lot of people. I mean, people are very concerned that the big issues that they think need to be addressed in this country are not addressed because of the inertia created by the two-party system. So quite possibly that would help you with your argument for proportional representation.
Yes, I think so. And that's certainly been the case in the UK, where people have just become so fed up with the system that there is now widespread community support for proportional representation, but it is being blocked by the Labor and Tory establishment.
And just a final one, Christine, you had a considerable number of years' experience in the Senate, a chamber of parliament that does essentially elect its members proportionally, although, of course, it's a state's house, so it's proportionally in each state, but not proportionally nationally, if you get the drift. My feeling was that the public have become quite affectionate toward the Senate precisely because it does have a greater diversity of voices. There's not, from what I can tell, a huge disillusionment at the Senate being overly obstructionist. Is that the sense that you got from your many years as a senator?
Absolutely, and especially because of the work of the Senate committees. So on those Senate committees, you have people of all political persuasions, but on those committees, you're travelling all around Australia to regional areas as well as city areas, and you're inviting submissions from the general public, and you are taking submissions and people are coming in to talk and so on. So people actually like that consultative process that they're getting with an across-the-board interest in legislation or in solutions. But where it goes wrong is those Senate committees then make their recommendations, but it is the government of the day which chooses whether or not to take up those recommendations, and 9 times out of 10 they don't. So that's where the community is getting cross, because they think I put all this effort and time into my submission, into appearing and so on, and nobody took a blind bit of notice. Well, essentially, often a lot of notice is taken, but the government of the day is able to just not do anything. So that is a problem. In terms of outcomes in the Senate, certainly we drove a number of really critical reforms in the Senate, but most of those were achieved as a result of agreements to form government. So the reason we have a budget office in the federal parliament is because it was one of the items the Greens had on our agreement list with Prime Minister Gillard at the time that we signed that deal for government. So it was the carbon price, it was the parliamentary budget office, there were a range of things. Once they were in government, I can tell you, she didn't add to the list, and we had to fight really hard to make sure they delivered everything on the list, and in the end, she didn't deliver the donations reform. So that's what I mean. You negotiate, you get the best you can, but once they are in government, once they're on those ministerial seats and offices, then the chances of driving significant change after that are relatively small. And where budgets are concerned, well, you obviously can't block a budget. You can move to change various bits and pieces in a budget, but there is such a disproportionate amount of power between the government being able to frame, with 32% of the vote, being able to frame a budget with 100% of the ministries and 100% of the say, and you're just trying to claw bits back or move bits around. And so having to negotiate a budget across a number of parties rather than saying, here it is, now debate that and we'll block any attempts you make to change it. That's really the difference.
Look, I'm sure that you were able to achieve less than you wished you could have with that arrangement with the Gillard government. Nonetheless, there are many people who point to that period of Australia and they say, look, here was a minority period of government in Australia. It was not gridlock. In fact, quite a lot of legislation got passed. It was an active part of parliamentary time where we got some reforms legislation through, proof at least that minority governments can certainly deliver legislation and change.
Yes, in fact, it was a record amount of legislation that was passed. We delivered new institutions for Australia, like the Parliamentary Budget Office, for example, which everybody now would say, how on earth did we manage without one? We also secured the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which everybody now says, oh, look, aren't they wonderful institutions, not realising they actually were driven during that period of minority government. But what's really interesting, Paul, is that Labor disowns it. A lot of people in the community point a finger and say, look at all the things they achieved, wasn't that great? And it was, but Labor never does. Labor disowns it, which I find extraordinary, and that's because they don't want to admit that minority government can actually be successful, because it counters their main argument that you need a stable majority government. So you will never hear the Labor Party say that the Gillard government was a highly successful period with the Greens in balance of power. You'll never hear that come out of their mouth.
Well, Christine, look, I hope this discussion and indeed the chapter you've written for the book, What's the Big Idea, does indeed spark a conversation along these lines. Been great talking to you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Paul.
Christine is currently a Global Greens ambassador, and among her many notable achievements is that she is a former senator and leader of the Australian Greens. The Australia Institute believes in big ideas and delivering research that matters, but we can't do it all alone. We need people like you who understand that real change doesn't come from playing it safe. That's why we're asking for your support. Sign up to our mailing list to get involved, and if you have the means, you can also donate to ensure we can keep fighting for a better, cleaner, fairer Australia. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Australia is at a crossroads. With its thumping majority, the Labor government has an opportunity to deliver generational reform. At the Australia Institute, we'll keep fighting to make big gas pay, to build a fairer tax system, and to make the truth matter again. But we can't do it without your support. By making a tax-deductible donation today to our end of financial year appeal, you'll help fund research changing Australia for the better. You can give now by visiting our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or via the link in the show notes.